The morning Sallie Carter signed her name on the deed to the lower flood plain along the Cimarron River, every man in the land office laughed hard enough to rattle the windows. It was the spring of 1878, and the territory of Kansas was still raw and unpredictable, a place where the wind came off the open plains like something alive and angry, where towns rose up out of nothing and fell back into the dirt just as fast, and where a woman buying land alone was already enough to set tongues wagging before anyone even looked at which land she was buying. But Sallie Carter had walked into that office in Dodge City on a Tuesday morning with $43 in gold coin, a forged signature of consent that she would later admit to no one, and a determination in her dark eyes that the land agent, a heavy man named Tillman Greer, could not bring himself to challenge directly. He did not challenge it. He just laughed. And when he laughed, the two cowboys leaning against the far wall laughed too. And when the news spread to the Silver Spur Saloon by noon, the laughter there was louder still and seasoned with whiskey. The flood plain along the lower Cimarron was 60 acres of flat river-bottom land that flooded nearly every spring, dried into cracked mud by July, and produced nothing that any reasonable farmer wanted to grow. The asking price had been deliberately low because the previous owner, a rancher named Burl Detweaver, had been trying to unload it for 2 years. When Sallie Carter showed up with coin in hand and asked for the deed, Burl Detweaver had practically run to the land office before she could change her mind, and he had shaken her hand with the enthusiasm of a man who had just been rescued from a burning building. By sundown that Tuesday, half of Dodge City was calling her Reckless Sallie. By Wednesday morning, it was just reckless. She heard it said without cruelty and with plenty of it, depending on who was saying it, and she absorbed every instance of it with the same quiet, measuring look she gave everything. She was 26 years old. She had arrived in Dodge City 8 months earlier from Missouri with her younger sister, Clara, who was 19 and pretty in the way that drew attention Sallie herself had learned long ago not to depend on. Sallie was not plain, but she was the kind of woman whose looks required patience to appreciate. A strong jaw, watchful brown eyes set wide apart, a mouth that pressed flat when she was thinking hard, and a quality of stillness about her that some men found unsettling and that most men simply overlooked. She worked the breakfast shift at the Drover's Rest boarding house, making biscuits and pouring coffee from 4 in the morning until 10, and she had been saving every cent above her and Clara's expenses for the better part of a year. The plan she had in her head was not the plan anyone else would have chosen. But Sallie Carter had not lived 26 years in this world by taking the plans that other people chose for her. Her idea was simple in the way that ideas made from close observation and hard thinking are simple. The Cimarron flooded every spring, yes, but the Cimarron also deposited a rich dark silt across that flood plain every single time it rose, and the soil it left behind was some of the most fertile ground in that part of Kansas. The problem was timing, which meant the problem was drainage, which meant the problem was solvable with enough labor, and the right arrangement of shallow ditches cut back toward the river. She had been reading everything she could get her hands on about irrigation and land management, and she had talked to an old Mexican farmer named Eduardo Ruiz, who worked a plot south of town, and who had told her, in careful English that he spoke better than most people assumed, that if the water could be guided rather than fought, river-bottom land like the lower Cimarron plain was worth 10 times what anyone was paying for it. She trusted Eduardo Ruiz's opinion considerably more than she trusted Tillman Greer's laughter, so she had her land, she had her plan. What she did not have, as she walked back down the main street of Dodge City with the deed folded inside her coat, was any particular awareness that her life was about to become considerably more complicated because of a man named Homer Finley. Homer Finley was not from Dodge City. He had ridden into town 3 weeks earlier from a cattle outfit out of Texas, having made the drive north with a herd of longhorns, and then found himself, as sometimes happened to men in their late 20s who had been sleeping under the open sky for months, reluctant to turn immediately around and go back. He was 30 years old, lean in the way that outdoor work made a man lean, with brown hair that needed cutting and the kind of sun-darkened skin that made his gray eyes startlingly light by contrast. He had a habit of listening more than he talked, which was unusual enough in a cattle town that several people had commented on it, and he had found temporary work at the livery stable while he considered his next move. He had been standing outside the land office when Sallie Carter came out with her deed, not because he was waiting for her or had any interest in her business, but simply because he had been passing by on his way to the general store and had heard the laughter from inside, and paused the way a person does when they hear something out of the ordinary. He had seen her come through the door, had seen the controlled set of her face, the way her chin was up by maybe a fraction of an inch more than it naturally sat, the way she walked as if the laughter behind her was a weather event that she had noted and filed, and did not intend to let alter her course. He had thought, in the brief moment before she walked past him, that is a woman who has made up her mind about something. He had then gone about his business and thought no more about it for the rest of the day. But Dodge City in 1878 was a town of maybe 1,500 people at its busiest, and in a town that size, paths crossed whether people intended them to or not. Sallie and Homer met properly for the first time 4 days after she bought the land, when she came into the livery to hire a horse and wagon for the purpose of driving out to look at her property, and he was the one who arranged it for her. He had recognized her. He had not said anything about it. He had brought out a solid bay mare and a wagon with decent wheels, quoted her a fair price, and helped her load the 2 shovels and the coil of measuring rope she had brought with her. He had noticed the shovels. He had not asked. Most people would have asked. It was the not asking that made Sallie look at him a second time and then a third before she climbed up onto the wagon seat. "You know the Cimarron road," she said. "Well enough," he said. "Is there a place where the plain opens up on the south side before the Big Bend?" "About 4 miles out," he said. "You'll see where the cottonwoods thin out. The ground drops off maybe 6 feet and goes flat." She looked at him steadily. "How do you know that?" "I rode out that way Sunday," he said. "Nothing else to do." It was an honest answer, and she could tell it was honest, which was useful information about a person. She nodded, picked up the reins, and drove out of town. Finley watched the wagon go and then went back to his work, and he told himself he was not thinking about the woman with the shovels and the measuring rope, which was how he knew that he was. He thought about her all afternoon. The land was exactly what she had expected, and exactly as challenging. Standing at the edge of the low ground while the spring air moved through the cottonwoods, and the river ran brown and purposeful in its banks 40 yards to her north, Sallie walked the 60 acres with her rope, and her measuring eye and her head full of Eduardo Ruiz's patient explanations about water behavior. The soil was dark and deep where the floods had touched it. The problem areas were 3 low points at the western end, where water pooled and went stagnant, sitting long enough after each flood to prevent planting. She took measurements. She made notes in the small leather journal she carried everywhere, and she stood in the middle of her land in the April afternoon and felt the particular fierce satisfaction of a plan taking physical shape. She also felt, if she was being honest with herself, the first small fingers of doubt. The shoveling work to create even 3 short drainage channels would take weeks for one person working alone, and she could only spare her afternoons, since the mornings belonged to the drover's rest and Clara needed help in the evenings. Hiring labor was not within her current means, and the planting season would not wait forever. She drove back to town as the sun was going orange behind the flat western horizon, and she returned the horse and wagon to the livery, and Finley was still there, forking hay in the dim interior. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked. Not prying, just the kind of thing a person says. "Found it and then some," she said. Then, because she was practical rather than proud in the way that sometimes leads people to suffer unnecessarily, I need to move a considerable amount of dirt before the end of May. Do you know anyone in town who might be available for day labor? Reliable, I mean, not just willing. Homer set down his fork. What kind of dirt moving? She told him. Not all of it, not the whole vision, just the immediate practical need. 3 drainage channels, each about 40 yards long, maybe 2 feet deep, angled back toward the river at a shallow grade to carry standing water away from the low ground. He was quiet for a moment. He had a way of going quiet that was not blank but rather full, as if thinking was something he took seriously enough to give it actual space. I could do that, he said. She looked at him. I can pay $1 a day. That is all I can manage right now. That is fine, he said. She studied him for another moment in the way she had, measuring, not unfriendly but thorough. I'm not offering this as charity work, and I'm not looking for charity work in return. I am looking for reliable labor at a fair price. I understood that, he said. There was no offense in his voice. All right, she said. Can you start Thursday? I can start Thursday, he said. She left the livery, and Homer Finley stood in the hay-smelling dark for a moment before he picked up his fork again, and he was aware that something had shifted slightly in the shape of his days, the way a door opening in a closed room changes the quality of the air. Clara Carter, who was sharp in ways that complemented her prettiness rather than being obscured by it, noticed immediately when Sallie came home that evening with something slightly different in her expression. Clara was rolling out biscuit dough at the boarding house kitchen table because they ate their meals there in exchange for Sallie's breakfast shift work, and she looked up and said, "You found someone to help with the ditching." Sallie hung up her coat. "I found someone." "Who?" "A man at the livery. Homer Finley. He came in with the Texas cattle drive last month." Clara considered this. She was generous with her opinions. "Is he honest?" "I think so," Sallie said. "I could be wrong, but I think so." "Is he going to be difficult about you being the one giving directions?" "If he is, I will dismiss him and find someone else," Sallie said simply. Clara smiled at her dough. "You are the least romantic person I have ever known, Sallie." "I am the most practical person you have ever known," Sallie said. "Those are not the same thing." Homer Finley arrived at the meeting point on the Cimarron Road on Thursday morning at 6. Which was 30 minutes before Sallie had asked him to arrive, not because he was anxious to impress her, but simply because he was the kind of man who arrived early to things. He had borrowed a good spade from the livery and brought his own canteen and his own lunch, a fact which Sallie noted and which told her something useful. He was competent. That was the first thing she could say about him with certainty. He looked at the ground the way she had described it, looked at the angle she wanted the channels cut, and did not argue with the plan or suggest modifications that stemmed from the assumption that he knew better. He asked 2 genuine questions about the grade she wanted, listened to the answers, and went to work. They worked on opposite ends of the same channel that first day, moving toward each other through the dark soil, and the only sounds were the river and the birds and the steady rhythm of digging. It was good work. Sallie had not done much field digging in her life, but she was strong from years of practical labor, and she fell into the rhythm of it without complaint. Around midday, they stopped and sat in the shade of the biggest cottonwood with their lunches, and it was the first time they had actually been close enough for an extended conversation, though neither of them rushed toward it. Homer ate his bread and salt beef and looked out at the river, and Sallie ate her biscuits and cold sausage and made a note in her journal. "What will you plant?" he asked eventually. "Sorghum to start," she said. "It tolerates the soil chemistry well, and there is good market for it with the cattle outfits. After 2 seasons I want to try corn." He nodded. "You have thought about this for a while." "About a year," she said, "and everyone in town thinks you are reckless." She looked at him. His tone was not mocking. It was more like he was laying out a fact for examination. "They do," she said. "The soil is remarkable," he said. "I noticed it when I was digging, dark all the way down." "The floods bring it," she said. "Every season the Cimarron deposits more of it. The land gets richer every year, not poorer. Most farmland here is the opposite." He looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that she could not quite classify, something between respect and curiosity that felt more personal than the situation strictly required. She looked away first, which was unusual for her. They worked until the light failed. By the end of that first Thursday, the first channel was half complete. Over the following 3 weeks, Homer Finley came to the flood plain every day that the weather allowed, which was most days. They fell into a working pattern that felt natural in the way that things feel natural when two people are well matched in their work habits without knowing it yet. He was steady and did not need direction once he understood a task. She made decisions efficiently and without the performance of authority that insecure people use to convince themselves they are in charge. They talked more as the days went on, the conversation coming gradually like the loosening of stiff joints in the morning, slow at first and then easier. She learned that he had grown up in Tennessee, had come west at 22 with no particular plan except to be somewhere large and open, had spent 8 years doing cattle work without ever having intended to make it his whole life. He had a precise, careful mind that he had applied mostly to the logic of livestock and landscape, but that clearly had a broader range than that. He had read more books than most cowboys she had encountered, which she mentioned, and he said that books were easier to carry than most people assumed, and that the long nights on trail drives left a man with time on his hands. He learned that she had grown up in Missouri as the eldest of 5 children, that her father had died when she was 16 and her mother 2 years later, and that she had spent the intervening years being quietly, systematically responsible for everyone around her before deciding at 25 that she was going to be responsible for herself. He learned that she had gotten the idea for the flood plain land from a book about river agriculture that a traveling salesman had left behind at the boarding house, and that she had read it 3 times. He learned that she had a direct, unsentimental way of speaking about her own history that was not coldness, but rather the earned simplicity of someone who had processed things fully and moved on. Clara visited the land twice during those weeks and reported back to various people in town that her sister appeared to have everything well in hand, though this did not substantially reduce the community opinion that Sallie Carter was reckless, because the channels were not yet complete and the river had not yet behaved, and the proof was still theoretical. One evening in the 3rd week of their work together, as they were loading their tools back into the wagon in the blue dusk, Homer said, out of nowhere in particular, "I have been thinking about staying." Sallie finished securing the spades. "In Dodge City, in this part of the country," he said, "there is good land available east of here, nothing as interesting as this but solid ground." She did not ask him why he was telling her. They both understood why he was telling her, at least partly, even if neither of them was prepared to say so directly. Instead she said, "Have you farmed before?" "Raised on a farm," he said. "Know the work well enough." "Cattle work pays better in the short term," she said. "Short term is a short horizon," he said. She almost smiled at that. It was exactly the kind of thinking she had. She did not say so. She climbed up onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins. "Well," she said, "that is a decision for you to make." He rode his horse alongside the wagon for a while on the road back to town, the last light fading off the flat Kansas sky, and neither of them said much more. But the space between them was different than it had been. Warmer, more aware of itself. Clara saw it that evening in Sallie's face and had the sense not to mention it. She only poured her sister an extra cup of tea and left it at that. The 3rd channel was completed on a Friday at the very end of April. Sallie and Homer stood side by side and looked at the work. 3 neat lines cut into the dark earth, angled precisely back toward the river, and Sallie felt the same fierce satisfaction she had felt the first day she stood on her land, except that it was larger now because it was real rather than projected. "That is good work," she said. "It is," he agreed. She paid him what she owed him, $15 for 15 days, which she handed over in coin, and he accepted it without ceremony. Then neither of them moved for a moment. "The question now," she said, "is whether the drainage works when the flood comes." "It will work," he said. He said it with the quiet confidence of someone who has done enough physical calculation to trust the result. "I hope you are right," she said. "I'm usually right about things I have thought through carefully," he said. Then after a pause, "I am sometimes wrong about things I have assumed without thinking them through." She looked at him. There was a quality to that statement that she recognized as more than commentary on drainage engineering. "Such as," she said. He looked at her directly, those pale gray eyes steady. "Such as assuming that this was straightforwardly a business arrangement." The word hung in the April air. The river moved behind them. A red-tailed hawk crossed the sky in a wide, unhurried circle. Sallie Carter said carefully, "What else would it be?" "I don't know yet," he said, "but I think something else." She turned and looked at the river for a long moment. Then she said, "I am not a woman who moves quickly toward things." "I know that," he said. "I am not a man who needs things to move quickly." She nodded once slowly. "All right," she said, and then she drove the wagon back to town. In the weeks that followed the completion of the drainage channels, Homer Finley did not leave Dodge City. He continued his work at the livery, which gave him enough to pay for his board at a rooming house on the north side of town, and he began spending his free afternoons on horseback, riding the land east of town that he had mentioned, asking careful questions of the people who knew it, building up a picture of what was available and what it would cost. He also found reasons to be at the drover's rest around the time when Sallie finished her breakfast shift, which she noticed and which she did not discourage. They fell into the habit of walking together on the occasions when she was going to the general store or the hardware merchant for supplies, and these walks became one of the better parts of both their days without either of them announcing that fact. They talked about everything. She was surprised by him, continuously, which was not something she expected because she was very good at reading people, and she had thought she had him mostly mapped out. But he had depths that revealed themselves at odd angles, a strong sense of moral geography that had been formed by experience rather than by instruction, opinions about things like land use and community obligation, and the treatment of people who were routinely ignored, that she found herself agreeing with often and disagreeing with interestingly. The injustices of the territory were not abstract to either of them. They had both watched the Comanche and Cheyenne lose ground in Kansas, dispossessed by the same expansion that was bringing settlers like themselves onto the plains, and when the subject came up between them, one afternoon, walking back from the hardware store with a bag of iron staples for her fence posts, Homer said with a directness she appreciated, "I benefit from this land being available because other people lost it. That is not a comfortable thing to carry, but it seems important to carry it honestly." Sallie said, "I think about Eduardo Ruiz. He has farmed south of town for 12 years, and the men at the land office treat him as if he does not exist." "He taught me more about this land than any of those men know." Homer nodded. "I have talked to him. He is a remarkable farmer." "He is a remarkable person," Sallie said. "Farming is just one of the things he is." There was a brief, warm pause in which they both understood that this was the kind of conversation that distinguishes people who are merely attracted to each other from people who are genuinely suited to each other. The distinction felt important. He walked her to the boarding house door that afternoon and stood on the step below hers, which brought him almost to her height, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then he took off his hat and said, "Sallie," just her name. Nothing else. But it was the first time he had used it without a question attached, and she heard everything in it. She said, "Homer," with the same quiet weight. He put his hat back on and said, "I will see you tomorrow." "You will see me tomorrow," she confirmed and went inside. Clara was sitting right inside the door sewing, with the look of a person who had not been listening but definitely had been listening. "I am not going to discuss it," Sallie said. "I did not say a word," Clara said, and her smile was enormous. May came in warm and breezy, and Sallie Carter began the work of planting her flood plain, which required first that the ground be turned, which she did herself over 6 days that left her arms aching and her hands blistered and her spirit extremely high. Homer came on 3 of those 6 days without being asked, which she later told herself she should have objected to on principle but could not quite bring herself to do, because his presence on the land felt right in a way she had not fully anticipated. He also brought, on one of those days, a neighbor from the east side of town, a man named Roy Devers who had a walking plow and a pair of draft horses, and who, for a reasonable sum and the promise of a share of the first sorghum harvest, turned the rest of the ground in a day and a half. Sallie had not known about Roy Devers and would have spent another 2 weeks doing it by hand. She paid him immediately, shook his hand, and then looked at Homer with an expression that contained both gratitude and a mild, warm frustration. "You could have told me about him from the beginning," she said. "You hadn't asked," he said, "and you were doing it fine." "Fine is not the same as efficient," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I have learned to be careful about stepping in front of a woman who knows what she is doing. Tends to go poorly." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "That is either very perceptive or very convenient." "Both," he said pleasantly, and she laughed, which surprised them both because she was not a woman who laughed easily or often, and the sound of it, low and genuine, did something to the air between them that neither of them was entirely prepared for. He looked at her like she had just shown him something valuable that she did not know she was carrying. She looked away before he could see that she knew exactly what she had just shown him. The sorghum seed went into the ground in the 2nd week of May, and by the 3rd week of May the first green shoots were up, thin and hopeful in the dark river soil, and Sallie walked her 60 acres in the mornings before her shift at the Drover's Rest, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was uncomplicated happiness, or nearly uncomplicated. Because mixed in with it was the persistent, warm complication of Homer Finley, who had become woven into the texture of her days with a thoroughness that she had not fully intended, but could not honestly object to. On a Saturday evening in late May, there was a dance at the town hall, which happened roughly once a month and was one of the more genuine social events in Dodge City, attended by everyone from the cattle drovers to the merchants to the farm families from the surrounding territory. Sallie and Clara went together, as they usually did, Sallie in her better dress, which was a dark green calico that suited her, and Clara in her blue one, and they found Eduardo Ruiz and his wife, Maria, already there, and they all stood together near the door talking about the season's plantings and whether the summer would be as dry as last year's. Homer arrived about an hour into the evening with 2 men from the livery stable. Sallie saw him come in, but she did not make a point of noticing it, which was its own kind of noticing. He crossed the room in a line that was not perfectly direct, but was ultimately pointed toward her, and she had just enough time to decide that she was going to be perfectly natural about this before he arrived beside her, and said good evening to her, and Clara and Eduardo and Maria with an easy courtesy that belonged to a man genuinely comfortable with people when he respected them. He asked her to dance on the 2nd song of the evening, which was a reel, which was appropriate since it was public and well lit, and involved a fair amount of other people, and she said yes in the same tone she used for most transactions, which was direct and without frills. She was not a practiced dancer. Neither was he. They were both competent without being elegant, which suited them, and what she discovered in those few minutes was that he moved with the same quality of steadiness he brought to everything, sure of where he was in space, responsive to her movements without crowding them. The music was fast and there was no room for talking, and she was glad of it because the only thing happening in the middle of her chest was not anything she was ready to put into words. When the reel ended and the band moved into a slower tune, neither of them immediately stepped back to the edge of the room. They stayed where they were, and it was Homer who offered his hand for the slower dance, and it was Sallie who took it, And the dance was nothing scandalous by any standard of the time, just two people moving in a reasonable distance from each other. But it was the closest they had been since they had started working together, and both of them were acutely aware of it. "You are a better dancer than you let on," he said. "I'm not letting on anything in particular," she said. "I know," he said. "That is what I find interesting." She thought about that. Then she said, "You are a man who finds things interesting rather than dismissing them. That is not as common as it should be." "Where I grew up," he said, "dismissing things quickly was considered a sign of intelligence. It took me a long time to figure out it was the opposite." She looked at him. The lamplight was warm and uneven, and his gray eyes were intent on her in a way that was not aggressive but was very clear. She said, "Homer, what is it that you want?" He said, "I think you know what I want." "I want to hear you say it," she said. A brief smile moved across his face. "I want to court you properly, with your permission." She was quiet for a moment, which was long enough for him to begin to wonder if he had misjudged things, but he held still and waited, because he was the kind of man who had learned the value of waiting for the right answer rather than filling the silence with a lesser one. Sallie Carter said, "You have my permission." Clara cried a little bit when Sallie told her later that night, not from sadness, but from the particular emotion of watching someone you love step towards something good after watching them go without it for too long. Sallie found this embarrassing and touching in equal measure, and gave her sister a brief, firm hug, and told her to go to sleep. The courtship of Sallie Carter and Homer Finley was, in keeping with both their characters, practical on the surface and quietly intense underneath. He came on Sundays, and they drove out to the land together, and they walked the rows and talked about the plants and the drainage and the plans for the next season. And these conversations about sorghum and soil and water gradually became conversations about everything else, because the land was where they both thought clearly, and where the pretenses that people maintain in formal social situations fell away naturally. He told her about Tennessee, really told her, not just the facts but the texture of it, the particular grief of leaving a place you love because you cannot see yourself in the future it offers, and she understood that completely, because it was exactly what Missouri had been for her. He told her about a younger brother who had died of fever at 13, and she listened in the way she listened to important things, fully and without hurrying to fill the space afterward. She told him about the forgery on the land deed. She had not told anyone else this. She said it matter-of-factly, as if reporting a legal transaction, but her hands were slightly still in her lap in a way that told him it had cost her something to say it. He considered the information for a moment and then said, "The law requires a husband's consent for a woman to buy property alone." "Yes," she said. "And you had no husband." "No." "So the law was wrong," he said, as if this solved the question entirely, and the simplicity of his response was such a relief to her that she had to look away for a moment. One Sunday in June, when the sorghum was nearly knee-high and the drainage channels were holding perfectly and the weather had been kind, they were sitting in the shade of the big cottonwood by the river, and Homer said, "I put in an offer on the Delaney parcel east of town." She turned to look at him. "Did you?" 120 acres. Good soil, needs work on the fencing. The house is small but sound." She waited. He looked at the river and then back at her. "I want to be a neighbor worth having," he said. "And I want to be more than that when you are ready," she said. "How much more than that?" he said. "As much as you will allow." She looked at him for a long moment, and in that look she was doing what she always did, which was measuring things honestly, not against a romantic ideal but against the real question of whether this was true and whether it would hold. She had known him for 3 months. She had worked alongside him and talked to him and watched him deal with people she respected, and she had found no false note in any of it. She said, "I think I am almost ready." He nodded. He did not push. That was one of the things about him. Almost ready turned out to be 6 weeks, which brought them to mid-July, when the sorghum was tall and green and extraordinary, and the whole of Dodge City had quietly begun to revise its opinion of the woman it had called reckless, though not many people said so out loud yet. The summer was dry but not devastating. The drainage channels had done exactly what she had designed them to do, pulling the spring flood water efficiently back toward the river and leaving the field workable weeks earlier than any comparable land in the area. Eduardo Ruiz came out in June to look at the results and walked the length of the channels twice, and then turned to Sallie and said, "You did this well." "You told me how," she said. "I told you the principle," he said. "You understood what to do with it. These are different things." His wife Maria had come with him, a small, dark-eyed woman of about 40 who had an entire second conversation going on in her expressions at all times, and when she looked at Homer standing beside Sallie, her expression said things that Sallie pretended not to see. The crisis came in the third week of July, as crises in agricultural land often do, not from the expected direction but from a completely different one. A man named Dale Forsyth, who owned the largest ranch west of Dodge City and who had a long-standing pattern of using land in ways that were technically legal and morally indifferent, sent a man to Sallie with a written offer to buy her 60 acres for $55, $12 more than she had paid, accompanied by a verbal message that she should consider the offer carefully because it was the best she was likely to get. The verbal message had an edge to it that the written offer was careful to avoid. Sallie read the offer twice, folded it, put it in her pocket, and went to find Homer. Not because she needed him to tell her what to do, which she already knew, but because she wanted his judgment on the practical dimensions of what refusing was likely to mean. She found him at the livery and showed him the offer and explained the verbal message. Homer read the offer with the expression he wore when he was thinking rather than reacting. He said, "Forsyth has been trying to expand toward the river for 2 years. Your land is the last piece he needs for access to the southern bend." "I know that," she said. "Do you know that he has put pressure on other small landowners in ways that sometimes escalate?" "I had heard things," she said. "What do you know specifically?" He told her what he knew, which was more detailed than what she had heard, because the men at the livery talked and Homer listened. 2 families southeast of town had sold under circumstances that seemed rushed. One man had had his fence lines cut 3 times in 2 weeks before he finally sold. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "I am not selling." "I know you are not," he said. "But I need to know what to be prepared for," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think you do." They talked it through carefully, the way they talked through everything, practically and without panic. She needed witnesses to her property lines, formal documentation with the sheriff's office about her boundaries, and she needed people who were paying attention to what happened on her land. Homer offered to ride out and check the fencing every other day when she could not, and she accepted this as the practical offer it was, and also recognized it as something more than that, which she noted and kept. The fence line incident did occur. Once, in the first week of August, 2 of her western posts found pulled and the wire sagging. Homer found it on one of his checking rides, repaired it the same day, and reported it to the sheriff's office with a written account. The sheriff, a pragmatic man named Ellis Crane who had no particular love for Forsyth's methods, noted it officially and had a conversation with Forsyth's foreman that was apparently pointed enough to serve its purpose, because there were no more incidents. Forsyth sent a second offer in early August, higher this time. Sallie declined it by written note. No further offers came. The summer moved through August in long golden days, and the sorghum reached its full height and began to grain out, and the whole flood plain became something genuinely remarkable. 60 acres of deep green abundance on land that everyone had called worthless 8 months ago. People drove out from town to look at it, which Sallie found both satisfying and vaguely irritating, because where had all this interest been in April when she was the reckless one? Homer rode out with her on a Sunday in late August to walk the field, and she could see in his face the same thing she felt herself, which was the particular pleasure of having been right about something that mattered. She had not said "I told you so" to anyone in Dodge City, because it was not her style, but she had thought it. "The town is coming around," he said. "Let them come around at their own pace," she said. "I was not doing this for the town." "I know," he said. They were walking along the eastern edge of the field where the sorghum was heaviest, the grain heads nodding in the late summer heat, and the river glittered through the cottonwoods to the north. He stopped and turned to face her. "Sallie," he said, "I have bought the Delaney parcel. The deed came through Thursday." She had known this was coming. She had known it for weeks if she was honest with herself. She had been getting quietly ready for it. "Congratulations," she said. "It is 120 acres and a small house, and it is mine," he said. "And it is not enough." She looked at him. He said, "I want to ask you something important, and I want to do it properly, so I am asking first whether this is the right moment." She thought about the sorghum field around them, the river, the channels she had designed, the work they had done together, the weeks of Sunday afternoons in the cottonwood shade talking about things that mattered. She thought about the dance and his hand on her back and the way he had said her name that first time without a question attached. She said, "This is a very good moment." He took a breath. "Sallie Carter," he said, "I am asking you to marry me, not because it is practical, although it is, not because it makes sense for the land, although it does, but because I want to spend the rest of my days talking to you and working beside you and finding out what you are going to think of next. You are the most genuinely surprising person I have ever met, and I did not know I was looking for that until I found it." She was quiet for what felt like a long time but was probably 30 seconds. The sorghum moved around them. The hawk that seemed to have taken up residence over this particular piece of ground was there again, circling in its unhurried way. She said, "I will marry you, Homer Finley." And then, because she was Sallie Carter and not a woman who did things halfway once she had decided to do them, she stepped forward and kissed him, which was the first time, and it was simple and warm and exactly right. And Homer's hand came up to her face with a gentleness that said everything his careful words had left unspoken. The harvest came in September, and it was extraordinary. Roy Devers brought his horses and the cutting equipment, and Eduardo Ruiz came with his sons to help bind, and Homer came with 2 men from the livery, and they harvested the 60 acres in 4 days in a golden September week that felt almost ceremonious. Sallie moved through it in a state of contained, focused joy, directing and working and counting. And at the end of the 4th day, when the last of the sorghum was loaded, and she could see the dark turned earth of her field again, she stood at the edge of it and let herself feel it fully for a moment before she turned back to the work of organizing payment and transportation. The yield was good enough to cover her remaining debts and leave a reserve for next year's planting, with a profit margin that was modest but real. More importantly, the soil had behaved exactly as Eduardo Ruiz had promised it would, and the drainage channels had worked through 2 minor summer rains with no issues, and the western low points that had been her concern were now simply part of a functioning, productive field. She paid everyone what she owed them, to the dollar, on the day the last load was sold. Eduardo Ruiz shook her hand and said he expected to see her at the harvests for years to come, and she said she expected the same, and they meant it. The wedding was in October. Sallie and Homer had both agreed they wanted something simple and real, not elaborate, and the ceremony was held in the Dodge City Church on an October Saturday with Clara as Sallie's witness and Roy Devers as Homer's, and Eduardo and Maria Ruiz in the second pew looking very pleased with themselves, and a fair portion of the town in attendance. Some of whom were there from genuine warmth, and some of whom were there from curiosity, and some of whom were there because Sallie Carter had turned out to be right about the flood plain, and nobody wanted to miss whatever she was going to do next. Tillman Greer, the land agent who had laughed the loudest in January, was notably not present. Nobody mentioned his absence. The Reverend was a spare, earnest man named Whitfield who performed the ceremony with appropriate gravity, and when he reached the part where Homer made his vows, Homer said them in the way he did everything important, quietly and completely, looking at Sallie directly throughout. And Sallie said hers in the same register, her voice steady and her brown eyes clear. And Clara cried again, this time so genuinely and abundantly that Maria Ruiz put an arm around her. After the ceremony, there was a celebration at the Drover's Rest, because the proprietor, Mrs. Alma Hodge, had insisted on it and was a woman of formidable domestic determination, and there was food and music and dancing. And Homer danced with Sallie twice, the second time slower and closer than anything they had permitted themselves before, and she rested her forehead briefly against his shoulder in a moment that was entirely private despite being in a room full of people, and he put his hand against her hair very gently. And that was the most romantic moment either of them had ever experienced, which was typical of both of them, that it was quiet and undramatic and happened in the middle of something ordinary. The house on the Delaney parcel, which was now the Finley parcel, and which Sallie had already begun thinking of as theirs rather than his, was small and needed considerable work, but it was sound and warm and had good windows and a good hearth, and Sallie arrived in it the evening of their wedding day with a wagon full of her and Clara's belongings, and proceeded immediately to reorganize the kitchen, which Homer watched with an expression of great contentment. "The kettles go on the left side," he said helpfully. "The kettles go where they are most efficiently accessible," she said, "which is here." She moved them to the right side. He nodded. "You are correct," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. He was leaning in the kitchen doorway with his arms folded, watching her, and his expression was the one she had come to know as his happy expression, which was subtle and not demonstrative but entirely unmistakable once you knew it. She felt a warmth move through her that was not the hearth fire and that she no longer had any inclination to be cautious about. "Homer," she said. "Sallie," he said. "Come and help me with these shelves," she said. He came and helped her with the shelves. Clara moved into a small room at the boarding house where she had already become indispensable to Mrs. Hodge, and she seemed genuinely happy with this arrangement, which was a relief to Sallie, who had been slightly worried about Clara, not because Clara could not manage, but because Clara was the kind of person who needed community, and had found it here in a way that Sallie found satisfying to see. Clara had also made the acquaintance of a young schoolteacher named William Pratt, who had come to Dodge City that fall to run the new school. And while Sallie would have said it was too early to predict anything about that situation, she noted that Clara mentioned William Pratt more often than was strictly necessary for informational purposes, and she kept this observation carefully to herself. The first winter of their marriage was the good kind of difficult, which is to say it was cold, and the work of keeping a household running while planning the next season's planting was constant and demanding, and they did all of it together, which meant that they learned each other's working habits and preferences and limitations in the close, daily way that reveals things that courtship, however genuine, cannot. What Sallie discovered was that Homer was even steadier in daily life than he had appeared in the occasional, chosen moments of courtship. He was patient in ways she had not fully calibrated. He was also stubborn about certain things, not many, but the ones he was stubborn about he held to with a quiet persistence that reminded her, in a way she found startling and then touching, of herself. The thing he was most stubborn about was fairness. He had a strong and detailed internal map of what was fair, and when situations deviated from it, he noticed and did not let it pass without at least naming it. This was the quality that had made him, among the men at the livery, the one people went to when there was a dispute, because he would hear both sides with equal attention and give an honest accounting rather than a comfortable one. Sallie had her own strong sense of fairness, but she expressed it differently, through action rather than comment, through the structure of her agreements and the precision of her payments rather than through verbal declaration. They discovered that these two modes were entirely complementary, that his willingness to name things and her willingness to arrange things added up to something larger than either individually, and this discovery pleased them both in the way that finding unexpected fit pleases people. The winter gave them time for the longer conversations that field work and harvest seasons cut short. They talked about the land and the plans and the future, and they talked about history and people and the shape of the territory. And on some evenings they simply sat by the hearth reading, Sallie with her agricultural pamphlets and Homer with whatever book he had most recently acquired from the traveling merchant. And the silence between them was the best kind of silence, full of presence. She told him one evening in December about her father, really told him, the way she had never told anyone, not the facts which she had given him before, but the specific grief of losing him before she had understood him well enough to ask the questions she had needed to ask. And Homer listened all the way through without speaking, and afterward he said only, he would have been glad about this land. He meant the flood plain. He also meant something larger. She felt the truth of that and let it settle. By February she knew she was carrying their first child, and she told Homer on a Sunday morning at the kitchen table over coffee, with the directness she brought to all important information. And he went very still for a moment in the way he did when something moved him deeply, and then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and they sat like that for a while without needing to say anything. The news spread, as everything spread in Dodge City, and Clara cried for the third time in the Finley-related events of the past year, and Maria Ruiz brought a chicken and a jar of preserved plums, and said things in rapid Spanish that nobody fully translated but that conveyed warmth and approval, and Roy Devers shook Homer's hand with the same enthusiasm Burl Detweaver had shown Sallie at the land office, except that this time the enthusiasm was genuinely warranted. Spring came early in 1879, and the Cimarron was restless with it. There had been heavy snowpack in the mountains to the west, and the river was running high and fast by March, and by early April it was clear that the spring flood was going to be substantial, possibly the largest in several years. This news traveled through the farming community with the particular quality of dread that water news carries in agricultural communities, because a flood that is too large too fast does not deposit and recede gracefully. It batters and scours and leaves damage. The men in Dodge City who had spent the past year revising their opinion of Sallie Carter began, quietly and without quite saying so, to revise it back in the other direction. The new consensus, whispered in the Silver Spur and the general store, was that perhaps the drainage channels were adequate for a normal flood year, but perhaps this was not going to be a normal flood year. This opinion was held with the particular certainty of people who have no special knowledge of the situation, but have decided that bad news is sophisticated. Sallie was not unworried. She was not the kind of person who performed courage by ignoring legitimate concern. She rode out to the land in the first week of April to assess the channels and found them clear and functional, and she walked the length of each one and made measurements of the ground slope, and then she sat by the big cottonwood and thought about it carefully. The channels were built to handle a reasonable flood. What was coming might be larger than reasonable. What she needed was an additional overflow channel, a wider, shallower cut along the northern edge of the field closest to the river, that would catch the initial surge and direct it around the field perimeter before it could overwhelm the smaller internal channels. She could see exactly where it needed to go. It needed to happen in the next 10 days. She rode back to town and told Homer that evening, with her journal open on the kitchen table and her pencil marking the line of the proposed channel on her rough map of the property. He looked at the map for a moment. He had come to know her land nearly as well as she did from the months of working it and the winter of hearing her talk about it. He said, "That is the right solution." "I need help," she said. It cost her less to say this than it once had. "It is too much for 2 people in 10 days. I know who to ask," he said. The next morning Homer went to Eduardo Ruiz, who came and looked at the land and agreed with Sallie's assessment and said he would bring his sons on Saturday. Homer went to Roy Devers, who brought his 2 hired hands. Homer also went to William Pratt, the school teacher, who turned out to have grown up on a farm and who could handle a spade, and who arrived on Saturday morning with his sleeves rolled up before anyone asked twice. which confirmed several things about his character that Clara had been suggesting for months. They were 6 workers on the overflow channel over 4 days, working through a mild, steady April rain that made the digging easier and the standing around much less pleasant. And by the following Wednesday, the overflow channel was complete, a wide, well-graded cut along the north field edge exactly where Sallie's map had indicated. They all stood in the rain looking at it, muddy and tired. "Well," said Roy Devers, "it will either work or it won't." "It will work," said Sallie. Homer, standing next to her with mud on his coat and his gray eyes bright from the work, said nothing. But he was smiling in the way he smiled at things he believed in. The flood came in the 3rd week of April. It came on a Tuesday night, preceded by 2 days of hard rain that turned the Cimarron from fast and brown to something that moved with a low roar that you could hear from a quarter-mile away. By Wednesday morning, the river was over its banks and spreading across the low ground in a broad, muddy sheet. Sallie was at the field by dawn. Homer was already there when she arrived, on horseback, watching. Eduardo Ruiz arrived 20 minutes later. They stood at the high ground on the eastern edge and watched the water come. It hit the overflow channel at about 7 in the morning, and the channel caught it. The water moved into the cut and down the grade toward the river outlet exactly as the geometry required, not all of it, because the flood was large and the field took some water in its lowest corners. But the main body of the surge was directed away, around the field's northern edge, and the internal drainage channels handled the remainder with the efficiency they had been designed for. By noon, the water in the field itself was a few inches deep, enough to be standing water, but not enough to be destructive. By the next morning, half of it had drained back through the channels. By Friday, 3 days after the flood crest, the field was wet but intact, the topsoil enriched with exactly the kind of dark Cimarron silt that Sallie had been reading about for 2 years, and the overflow channel sat there in the morning light, full of receding water, having done exactly what it was designed to do. It was Homer who went into town that Friday. He had not planned to say anything in particular. He had simply gone to the livery and the general store and conducted his ordinary business. But people asked how the floodplain had fared, because they had been watching and waiting in the way that communities watch and wait when they have collectively predicted disaster, and Homer told them. He told them the overflow channel had worked. He told them the field was intact. He told them that the soil had received a fresh deposit of rich silt that would make this season's planting even more productive than last year's. He said all of this plainly and without drama, and then he said, to Tillman Greer specifically, who happened to be standing in the general store when Homer came in for tobacco, "I believe some people in this town called my wife reckless for buying that land." Tillman Greer cleared his throat. Now, that was not said with any malice, it was just that at the time the land seemed. It seemed like exactly what she knew it was, Homer said, still pleasant, still even, but extremely clear. "I think an apology is in order." There was a brief silence in the general store. The storekeeper looked carefully at the middle distance. A woman buying flour suddenly found the grain sacks very interesting. Tillman Greer said after a moment, "You may be right about that." "I am right about that," Homer said. He bought his tobacco and left. He did not tell Sallie about this exchange when he got home. She found out about it from Clara, who found out about it from William Pratt, who had heard it from the storekeeper. And by the time the account reached Sallie, it had been refined by 3 tellings into something slightly more dramatic than the actual event, but accurate in its essentials. Sallie was at the kitchen table with her accounts when Clara told her, and she went quiet in a way that meant she was processing something with feeling rather than just information. Then she closed her accounts book and put down her pen. She said, "He said that." "He did," Clara said, to Tillman Greer specifically. "Apparently he looked him straight in the eye," Clara said. Sallie sat with this for a moment. Outside the window the April afternoon was golden after the rain, and the cottonwood in their yard was just beginning to show green. She said, "That was not necessary." "No," Clara agreed, "but it was nice." Homer came home at 5:30 to find Sally sitting on the front step of the house in the afternoon sunshine, which was unusual because she was generally too busy to sit on steps. She looked at him when he came up the path with the same measuring look she had given him from the beginning, except that now it was full of a warmth that she no longer had any reason to moderate. "I heard about the general store," she said. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. "It needed saying," he said. "You did not need to fight my battles," she said, not reproachfully, clearly. "It was not a battle," he said. "It was a fact. The fact needed saying." She looked at him for another moment. Then she moved to one side of the step, which was an invitation, and he came up and sat beside her, and they looked at the yard together in the late afternoon. She said, "Thank you." "You are welcome," he said. After a moment she put her head against his shoulder, which she did not often do, because she was not given to that kind of easy physical ease, but which she did when she wanted him to know something that she did not quite have the words for. He put his arm around her, and they sat like that as the sun went down behind the flat Kansas horizon. Tillman Greer found Sally 2 days later at the general store, and he said, with the somewhat awkward sincerity of a man who is not used to apologizing, but has concluded that it is the correct thing to do, "Mrs. Finley, I may have been hasty in my judgment of your purchase last year. The land has clearly proven itself." Sally regarded him steadily. "Thank you, Mr. Greer," she said. "I accept your apology." She did not add anything further, which was the most effective possible response, and Greer nodded and retreated, and that was that. The spring planting of 1879 went into the most fertile ground Sally had yet worked, dark and deep and full of the Cimarron's generosity. She planted sorghum again on the eastern half and tried corn on the western half as she had been planning, which was a risk because corn in Kansas was variable and her first season might be poor. But Eduardo Ruiz had said the soil was ready for it, and she trusted his judgment. The corn was magnificent. It was not a perfect season. There were dry weeks in July that required hand watering in the critical germination period. But by late summer, the western half of the flood plain was producing ears that Sally felt some private pride about every time she looked at them. Roy Devers came out and walked the rows and said, shaking his head slowly, that he had never seen river-bottom corn like it. She was 5 months along with the baby by then, and moving through the summer heat with a quiet determination that impressed and slightly alarmed everyone who watched her work, particularly Homer, who had learned that there was a line between expressing reasonable concern and being overprotective, and that Sally regarded the second category as a form of disrespect that he was careful to avoid. He channeled his concern into practical things, being home when she needed to get off her feet, handling the heavier lifting without making a ceremony of it, making sure the water barrel was always full without announcing that he was making sure of it. She noticed everything he did. She did not always name it, but she noticed it, and the noticing added up over months into something very deep. Clara Carter and William Pratt announced their engagement in August, which was not surprising to anyone who had been paying attention, but was greeted with appropriate celebration. Sally was genuinely happy about this, not only because Clara was happy, which was paramount, but because William Pratt had turned out to be a man of genuine substance and decency, and the way he looked at Clara was something that Sally recognized from her own experience. The harvest of 1879 was the largest the flood plain had ever produced, and the largest Sally had dreamed of when she was reading that agricultural pamphlet in the Drover's Rest. The corn yield was remarkable and the sorghum yield was steady, and the combination gave her enough to pay off the remainder of her land debt, establish a working reserve, and begin making plans for next year that involved a small structure on the property itself, a storage barn, and a simple covered area for equipment. She was counting the final harvest numbers at the kitchen table in October when Homer came in from the field, and she looked up and said, without planning to, "Homer, we are doing very well." He looked at her. "We are," he said. "I thought you should know that I know that," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You mean that I am part of why?" "I mean that you are part of why," she said. "Yes." He came to the table and sat across from her and looked at her with the full presence attention he gave to important things. He said, "This was your vision. I have been lucky to be in it." "You made it larger," she said. "That is not a small thing." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the same gesture he had made in February when she told him about the baby, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they stayed like that while the evening came in through the windows and the October wind moved outside. Their son was born on the 18th of November, 1879, in the bedroom of the house on what used to be the Delaney parcel, delivered by the Dodge City midwife, Mrs. Parsons, a calm and competent woman who had shepherded a great many lives into the world on the Kansas frontier, and who took Sallie's no-nonsense approach to childbirth as a professional courtesy. It was a hard labor, 12 hours in the November cold, and Homer sat outside the bedroom door for most of it in a state of controlled but very genuine fear. And when Mrs. Parsons opened the door and said, "A boy, Mr. Finley, and your wife is fine," he had to sit still for a moment before he could stand up, and his hands were not quite steady. They named him James Carter Finley, the Carter for Sallie's family name and the James for Homer's brother who had died young in Tennessee, and the combination felt right and complete. James was a substantial baby, dark-haired like his mother, with his father's watchful quality in his eyes from very early on. He was not a simple or easy infant, but he was not difficult either, more interested in the world than in fussing about it. And Sallie recovered from the birth with a speed that did not entirely surprise Mrs. Parsons, who had assessed Sallie's general constitution and expected no less. Homer held his son on the first morning and was transformed in a way that he would have described to no one because he lacked the vocabulary for it, but that Sallie saw completely in his face and that she found more moving than almost anything she had ever observed. She said, "You are a good father already." He looked up from the baby. "I have not done anything yet." "Yes, you have," she said. Clara and William Pratt married in the spring of 1880, a small and warm ceremony, and Clara moved into the teacher's house on the edge of town and was so clearly happy in it that every time Sallie visited her, she felt the specific pleasure of seeing someone in exactly the right life. William Pratt was good to Clara in ways that were detailed and daily rather than grand and occasional, which was the kind of good that actually holds, and Sallie approved of him fully by the end of his first year in Dodge City and told him so directly, which he received with an expression suggesting that her direct approval was something he had been quietly hoping for. James Finley grew into his first year with the same combination of solidity and watchfulness that had characterized him from the beginning. He was walking by 11 months and talking in full sentences, or something close enough to full sentences, by his second birthday in November 1881, which was a source of great satisfaction to both his parents and great amusement to Eduardo Ruiz's family, who had adopted the Finleys into their social circle with the warmth that the Ruiz family extended toward people they genuinely respected. The flood plain by 1881 was a well-established and widely admired operation. Sallie had added the storage barn she had planned, and then a second small building for equipment. And in the fall of 1881, she proposed to Homer that they plant the western 40 acres with wheat the following year, because the corn rotation had improved the soil composition beautifully, and wheat would use those nutrients efficiently while the eastern 20 recovered. Homer, who had been farming the Finley land adjacent with a rotating combination of crops that had been genuinely profitable, and who had learned more about soil and water management from Sallie in 3 years than he had known in his entire previous life, said, "I think you are right about the wheat. I want to talk to Eduardo about winter varieties." "I have already talked to him," she said. "He recommends the hard red winter. He has been growing it on his south plot for 2 years. Homer looked at her. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since August," she said pleasantly. He shook his head, not in frustration, in the specific, warm admiration that had become one of the constants of his daily experience. Sallie found out she was carrying their second child in January of 1882. She told Homer in the same direct, morning-table way she had told him the first time, with coffee and without ceremony, and he responded in the same way he had responded the first time, going very still and then covering her hand with his, except that this time he also said, "James will be a good older brother." "He will be a very bossy older brother," she said. Homer smiled. "I wonder where he gets that." She gave him the look this deserved. Their daughter was born in September 1882, which turned the harvest season into the most complicated 3 weeks of Sallie's recent experience, because she refused to stop supervising the harvest from the front porch while in the final stages of pregnancy, a position that both Mrs. Parsons and Homer found alarming, and that Sallie maintained was perfectly reasonable since she was not doing the actual harvesting, only directing it, which was a distinction that she felt was clear and obvious. The baby came on September 14th, another 12-hour labor, the same November midwife, the same Homer outside the door, though less fearful this time and more present in the way of a man who has lived through something once and knows what is on the other side. They named her Ruth Maria Finley, the Maria for Maria Ruiz, who wept when she heard the name and hugged Sallie with a fierceness that expressed something beyond what Sallie's more reserved temperament could easily offer back, though she held on anyway. Ruth was smaller than James had been and louder, and had her father's gray eyes and her mother's manner of regarding the world with an assessing, unimpressed quality that in a newborn was faintly hilarious. James, at 2.5, received his sister with the interest of a person encountering an unusual animal, and then proceeded to be as protective of her, as Sallie had predicted he would be bossy, which turned out to be the same quality expressed in a different direction. The wheat went in the following spring, and the first wheat harvest of 1883 was good, not extraordinary but solid, which was appropriate for a first-year planting, and the soil profile coming out of it was exactly what Eduardo Ruiz had promised, stripped but not depleted, ready for the corn rotation that Sallie had planned to follow. By 1883, the lower Cimarron flood plain was no longer called reckless by anyone who looked at it. It was called one of the best-managed pieces of river-bottom land in western Kansas, which was said with the slightly proprietary pride of people who lived in the same county, as if they had always known it would be. Tillman Greer's land office had changed agents twice since 1878, and the current agent was a young man named Foster who had come into the territory in 1880 and who had no personal history with Sallie's purchase, and who referred to the Finley flood plain operation as a model of intelligent land use, which was exactly right and not quite enough, but which Sallie accepted as the reasonable accounting of history by someone who had not been there for the laughter. Homer had expanded the Finley land to 160 acres by 1883, adding the 40 acres adjacent to the original Delaney parcel, in a transaction with a homesteading family that had decided to move further west, and the combined operation of the flood plain and the Finley upland was producing enough to be genuinely comfortable and planned enough to be building towards something larger. They were not wealthy by any measure that the world they had come from would have recognized, but they were secure in the way that requires both material sufficiency and the kind of partnership that does not erode under pressure, and Sallie knew the difference between these two kinds of security and valued both, and understood that the second was rarer. On an evening in the fall of 1883, after the harvest was in and the accounts were settled, and James was in bed and Ruth was nursing, and the house was in the quiet that came after the long labor of a successful season, Homer came and sat beside Sallie on the wide front step that he had built the previous spring specifically, because she liked to sit outside in the evenings, and they watched the Kansas sky go through its elaborate October sunset. Sallie said, not looking at him, "I have been thinking about the next 5 years." "I know," he said. "You have been making notes in that journal since August. 10 more acres on the south end of the flood plain, she said. The Cimarron is predictable enough now that I think we can plant within 15 feet of the bank. The overflow channel will handle anything unusual. And the north side, he said. She looked at him. You saw that too. The ridge along the north side could be cleared for pasture, he said. Keeps the cattle on that side of the road and gives the field a wind break on the northwest, which you have been thinking about since last winter's freeze. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, We think alike. We do not think alike, he said. We think differently and we end up at the same places. That is better. She considered this. Yes, she said, that is better. Ruth made a small sound from inside, settling, and then was quiet again. James had been put to bed an hour ago and was probably already plotting something for tomorrow. The first stars were appearing over the dark line of the Kansas horizon. Homer said, Sally. Homer, she said. Are you happy? She turned and looked at him fully. It was a question she would have deflected a few years earlier, not from dishonesty but from the habit of a person who has been the reliable one for so long that their own interior condition becomes something to be accounted for only after everything else is settled. She did not deflect it now. Yes, she said, I am happy. He nodded, slow and complete. Are you? She said. He looked at her in the evening light with the gray eyes that had been clear to her from the beginning, even when everything else about him was still being measured and understood. He said, I am happier than I have ever been and I expect to be happier still. Yes. She reached over and took his hand, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they sat there together as the October dark came fully in, and the stars multiplied overhead, and the Kansas wind moved through the cottonwoods at the road's edge. And all of it, the land and the work and the 2 sleeping children inside, and the 5 years already behind them and the unmapped years ahead. All of it was theirs in the way that things belong to people who have earned them, not by luck or inheritance, but by vision and stubbornness, and the willingness to be right about something when everyone else was laughing. The Cimarron ran to the north of them, dark and steady in its banks, behaving itself as it did in the fall, having deposited its generous spring gift of dark silt across the flood plain that everyone had called worthless, and that Sallie Carter had known was anything but. The overflow channel sat quiet along the north field edge, ready for next spring as it had been every spring since Homer had stood in a general store and said what needed saying. Clara and William Pratt had a baby boy of their own by then, and the 2 families spent Sundays together often, the children growing up in and out of each other's houses, James and the Pratt boy thick as thieves, Ruth absorbing everything with her gray, assessing eyes, and her mother's quality of storing up information for later use. Eduardo and Maria Ruiz were at the Finley table for harvest suppers and holiday meals, and the kind of ordinary Tuesday evenings that accumulate into the actual texture of a life. And Eduardo and Homer had developed the particular friendship of men who respect each other's knowledge and compete with each other's yields in a spirit that was more generative than competitive. And their farms had each made the other better through 10 years of adjacent attention. The floodplain delivered its harvest every year, in the good years spectacularly, and in the difficult years sufficiently, and Sally walked its rows every spring with the same quality of fierce, clear satisfaction that she had felt on the first morning. She stood in its April light with a measuring rope and a leather journal, except that now it was larger and more fully known, and the satisfaction had depth rather than just direction. In the spring of 1885, when James was 5 and Ruth was 2.5 and Sally was carrying their 3rd child, which she had announced at the kitchen table over coffee as she announced everything, the Cimarron flooded again in the large, rolling way it sometimes did in a wet spring, and the overflow channel handled it without drama, and the field came through with its topsoil intact, and the new silt laid down in the places where Sally needed it most, and nobody in Dodge City said anything about reckless. Because there was nothing left to say except what Homer had said in the general store 7 years ago, which was that the fact had been there all along, waiting to be recognized by anyone patient and honest enough to look at it. Their third child, born in November of 1885, was a boy they named Henry Eduardo Finley. The Eduardo placed second and said with full weight, and when Eduardo Ruiz heard the name he was quiet for a moment, and then said something in Spanish that Maria translated as, "He says this is more honor than he knows how to hold properly." And Sallie said, "Tell him he holds it the same way he holds everything, with both hands and completely." Homer stood in the kitchen doorway listening to this exchange with his arms folded in the particular way he stood when he was moved by something. And when Sallie glanced at him across the room, something passed between them that was too long and too complex and too made of years to be called a look exactly, but that carried everything. The land and the work and the children and the dance and the cottonwood shade and the October step and the general store and all of it, every moment that had added up into the life they were standing inside of. She turned back to Maria and Eduardo and the baby in her arms, and Homer unfolded himself from the doorway and came into the kitchen to pour coffee for everyone. And James ran in from outside with mud on his boots to see the new baby. And Ruth followed, because Ruth followed James everywhere while pretending she was not. And the kitchen was full of people and noise, and the particular warmth of a house that is genuinely inhabited by people who want to be there. The Cimarron flood plain was 60 acres of dark river-bottom soil that everyone in Dodge City had said would never amount to anything, and Sallie Carter Finley had known otherwise, and she had been right, and the land had proved her right every spring when the river rose and every fall when the harvest came in, and the man who had been the first to say so publicly had been her husband, who had understood from the beginning what others had needed years to see. And it was enough, more than enough. It was a whole life, warm and full and entirely real, standing on ground she had chosen with both eyes open and both feet planted, doing work that mattered in the presence of people she loved, in a territory that was still wild enough to be interesting and tame enough to be home. The Kansas evening came in through the good windows of the house on what used to be the Delaney parcel, and Henry slept in his mother's arms, and James taught his boots to stop dripping on the floor under Ruth's critical supervision, and Homer poured coffee and Eduardo Ruiz laughed at something, and Maria took the baby so Sallie could use both hands. And outside the window the cottonwood was bare in the November evening, and the land was dark and resting after the harvest, and the sky over Kansas was full of stars, clear and cold and enormous. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was settled and right and theirs.